A History of English Literature by Arthur Compton-Rickett. Part 1. English Literature in the Making. Narrated by Anita Saran. The Anglo-Saxon at home. When first we catch a glimpse of the Anglo-Saxon tribes, they are leading a pastoral life on the shores of the Baltic and the North Sea, in a country bleak and low-lying. But the atmosphere of repose, which the word pastoral suggests to most people, is not to be found here. Our forefathers shared the intense restlessness that characterized the Germanic people as a whole. Tillers of the soil and hunters by compulsion, they became also by force of circumstance fierce sea rovers, inured by long privation to the terrors of the sea. They made little of its dangers, and a Roman writer has told us how that they would plunder the western coasts, sailing down upon them in their high-prowed warships in the midst of a storm, so that their victims might be the less prepared. Truly enough were they likened to sea-wolves. In appearance they were big, large-limbed men with blue-grey eyes and ruddy faces, relentless, savage and daring, yet courageous and faithful to one another, and among their women folk gentle and loyal. Infanticide was not infrequent, for valor was prized above all things, and a weakly child might survive only to bring shame and disgrace upon his kinsmen. Naturally enough, this ingrained passion for action expressed itself most readily in fighting. This was peculiarly attractive, for not only did it provide an outlet for their physical energy, but it afforded also an excellent chance of their gaining the Teutonic paradise of Valhalla. A courageous death on the field of battle opened the entrance to those halls in which a banquet of boar's flesh and ale was forever being celebrated. Moreover, war held out the prospect of material advantages. Energy does not necessarily imply industry, and the Germans were always ready to substitute plunder for labor whenever it was possible to do so. Piratical expeditions first brought the Anglo-Saxons into contact with this island. But the days were not long enough to satisfy these adventurous spirits. Therefore, when night fell, gambling took the place of fighting as a means of varying the monotony of existence. According to Tacitus, it was a serious occupation with them, even when they were sober. While to such a pitch were these games of chance carried, that sometimes even personal liberty was staked and lost. No catastrophe was more bitter than this, for the love of freedom was one of the most marked characteristics of the Teutonic races. It was this intolerance of constraint which explains why they so long preferred to live in small communities. They dwell scattered and apart, writes the Roman historian, just as a spring, meadow, or wood has attracted them. Moreover, even in the village itself, the houses were always detached from one another. The same spirit recurs in their political institutions. All questions of common interest were discussed in the presence of the freemen of the tribe, who signified their dissent by a murmur and their approbation by the clashing of spears. And it is quite characteristic that in early times, at any rate, business was delayed, perhaps for 2 or 3 days, by the casual manner in which the people assembled. With this pronounced individualism, it is therefore not surprising to find that the warrior chieftains controlled their followers rather by the force of example than by military discipline. Positive as well as negative reasons combine to make this the most effective method of control, for the Germans possessed a sense of personal loyalty in a marked degree. To support and protect a courageous leader on the battlefield was with them a point of honor, and to survive his death was to incur a lifelong disgrace. That this feeling of devotion was mutual is well illustrated by the legend that has gathered around the name of the great Ostrogoth, Theodoric. It tells us how his enemy, Ermenrich, having captured several of his men, demanded the entire surrender of Theodoric's kingdom as the price of their lives, and how the Ostrogothic leader not only consented to but actually fulfilled this condition of their safety. For he says, "Even though all the empires of the world were mine, I would give them away rather than desert my dear faithful thanes." Equally pleasing was their attitude towards strangers. Perhaps no race has ever been more renowned for its hospitality than the Teutonic. Every German, to quote Tacitus once again, receives his guest with a well-furnished table. When his supplies are exhausted, he who was but now the host becomes the guide to further hospitality, and without invitation they go to the next house. Having washed his hands and feet, the guest joined the family board, and using his fingers instead of a fork, helped to devour the vast quantities of meat which were always in requisition. The meal being brought to a lively, if somewhat hazardous conclusion by the practice of throwing the bones about the place, the more serious business of the evening began, namely the drinking. Around the blazing fire in the centre of the long hall, our ancestors sat far into the night, consuming ale with which their women folk supplied them. And should this prove of inferior strength, the feminine brewers suffered accordingly, for quality as well as quantity was deemed essential for these convivial gatherings. But though somewhat exacting in this respect, the Teutons made ample amends by the high esteem in which they held their women. In Anglo-Saxon times, a woman possessed liberties which it has taken her centuries to recover. Not only were the rights of property and of taking judicial proceedings accorded to her, but she was also allowed to attend the meetings of the township in which local politics were discussed, and on occasions even the National Council of the Witanagemot. Martial unfaithfulness was both rare and punishable. But though making good husbands, the Anglo-Saxon by no means favoured absolute equality of the sexes. Whilst a girl was still a spinster, she was under paternal authority, and marriage merely effected a transfer of masters. Should she prove insubordinate, 3 blows with a broomstick were considered a wholesome corrective. Yet with all its limitations, the Teutonic conception of womanhood was superior, not simply to Oriental ideas, that would not be saying very much, but even to the notions of such a highly civilized people as the ancient Greeks. The Germanic people compared most favorably with the nations of the East in another particular, namely in their capacity for progress. The Teutons possessed to quite a remarkable extent the power of adapting themselves to strange surroundings and of assimilating a foreign civilization. It is this aptitude which accounts for the absorption of Gothic customs and ideas that transformed Norsemen into Normans with such surprising rapidity, and explains the speed with which the antagonisms of 1066 were forgotten in this island. Of all racial endowments, there are perhaps none more valuable than this mental elasticity, and it would be difficult to overestimate its influence upon the national history of the Anglo-Saxon people. English literature before the Saxon conquest. The earliest English literature is unwritten. It consists of songs and legends, heroic and stirring in character, sung to the harp by the minstrel and gleeman, and handed down from one generation to another. Parents taught these tales to the children, and the younger learned of the elder singer. Our Saxon forefathers used an alphabet just as the Scandinavians did, but it was used for inscriptions and not for distinctively literary purposes. It served to adorn a sword hilt, not to perpetuate a legend. So it is impossible to say by whom these old stories and myths were originally composed, for they come to us out of the dim past, with the accretions of years upon them, and with the impress of many a singer, each of whom has unconsciously added something to the ancient tale. It is not until much later that these old stories were written down, and the blend of Christian and pagan sentiment is due to the fact that many were first set down after the introduction of Christianity, when the monk who took them in hand wished to infuse religious sentiment into the rough heathen saga. But if in olden times the poetry was unwritten, this was not because it was lightly esteemed. The minstrel was a preacher and moralist of heathen times. His song stirred men to deeds of courage and endurance. He glorified the heroes of the past, offered solace to the chieftain whose fortunes had been marred, and renewed in him fresh hope for the future. No day was complete without the minstrel's aid. After the fighting and hunting, when the chieftain and his followers were refreshing their bodies with meat and drink, then came the gleemen to minister to their minds, and the songs sung then were stored up in the warriors' memories, so that in the stress of battle they might shout out, as did the Israelites of old, some snatch of song which would at once inspire themselves and confound their enemies. The minstrel was not the only singer, albeit the chief. So far as we can tell, the most important minstrel was the shaper of verse. He composed verses as well as sang them. The secondary minstrel and the gleeman, or harper, merely repeated them. His was a less dignified post, and the very name suggests that he was not merely a singer, but a maker of fun, from glio, which equals fun, amusement. In this personage, therefore, we may trace the early jester, who was to take such a prominent part in medieval entertainments. Indeed, he lasted until Elizabethan times, and was inseparable from the earlier dramas of the age. Our Saxon forefathers, then, were in common with other nations of the time a singing folk. Not only did the chieftain have his own bard to cheer him, but he himself, witness Hrothgar in Beowulf, was a singer. He carried his song along with his sword into battle. His whole life was a chant. On his way to the fight, ploughing through the sea storm, he sang. After the strivings were over, at the festive board, he sang again, and was sung to. In the moment of victory, he sang exultantly to his gods, the sky and the earth, and their gracious sun, the summer. In the hour of death, he used his last breath to sing a farewell to his people. The circling seasons, the alternate reign of day and night, fed his imagination and found expression in the many nature myths that served as his early religion. Then, onto these myths became grafted stories of the great men who had done mighty deeds, and soon the doings of the heroes became one with the doings of the gods. An early example of this is found in the poem Beowulf, that arose as an oral saga made up of pagan songs celebrating the hero's prowess long before it was written down and Christianized by the monks.